What's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. This is episode 3, and for this one, we're in Oceanside for a short staycation in the lovely state of California. The ocean breeze here is absolutely wonderful, though it is pretty darn hot here even for this time of year. We're down here just to take a breather from the daily life grind, and what better way to blow off some steam than to head over to Ocean's 11 to play some poker. We'll be sitting down at the 2-5 game, which has a $300 to $800 max buy-in. While we did put our names on the 5-10 list, the game was situated away from the main floor, and from how it was unofficially explained, it was more of a private game in a public casino. The floor was nice enough to put me on the list, but needless to say, that's as far as it went. Before we get into poker hands, I wanted to briefly share some particulars at this casino for those who might consider visiting. First, the casino floor is like a big warehouse with a bunch of tables inside and overhead fluorescent lighting. About half the floor contains your typical California games, and the other half of the floor is dedicated to poker. While I did not partake in any of the services, they seem to be pretty on top of the food service and other services like the at-the-table massages, which isn't too atypical for California casinos, but this one seemed to be much more attentive and on top of their game. And lastly, for those wondering what those yellow wristbands are, like the person to my left is wearing, no, it's not for a nightclub, but rather all vaccinated individuals receive one on the way into the casino, which allows them to play maskless, should they choose to. I think this was the majority of the people entering the casino, though I might have seen 1 or 2 people without the wristbands on. Okay, enough talking, let's get into some hands. Within the first 2 orbits of sitting down, there were a few observations to note. This table has a bunch of guys just playing street poker. Although unofficial, the $10 straddle was practically on for everyone at the table. Also, it seemed like there were plenty of players happy to put money in the middle and call down light even with bottom pair. I definitely got the sense of the shenanigans going on at this table early on. In this first hand, the under the gun limps for 10 as he's been doing habitually, and as it folds around to the small blind, I look down at pocket 5s. The small blind raises to 35, I call 35, and the straddle calls for 35, while the under the gun limper folds, which was somewhat surprising. The flop comes 3-3-6 with 2 spades. The small blind leads for 50, which is relatively small to the relation of the pot. I call here as he's been the most active, and while the small blind is clearly weak here, I have the straddler behind who's yet to act. The downside to taking this line is now I'm entering realization, which the straddler could take advantage of. That said, the straddler folds, and we go heads up to the turn. The turn brings a 9 of hearts, and the action checks through. The river is the queen of clubs, and again it checks to me. I think this spot constitutes a pretty typical check back. I'm still ahead of most ace-high holdings, and I'm never getting better to fold. The villain shows pocket 4s, and we win our first pot of the session. In this next hand, we find pocket 10s in the cutoff. Action folds to me, and I raise to 35. The button calls 35, and the big blind calls after some facial expressions of disdain and contemplation. Mostly disdain, but some contemplation. The flop is ace-queen 4 with 2 spades. Action checks around. When the turn brings the 5 of hearts, the big blind checks, and I decide to throw out a delayed continuation bet of $75 here. The big blind isn't checking here twice with anything overly strong, and the button had already given up on the flop. Both opponents quickly fold behind. At this point, I had to cut my time short after only being at the table for about 90 minutes due to a personal matter. However, I would be back tomorrow to wrap up my session. The following day, we're seated in the 2-5 game after a short wait, and we immediately find ourselves with ace-7 offsuit in the big blind. The straddle is on by someone who looks like an OMC, but he clearly isn't, as he's straddling oddly enough. Anyhow, the hand folds all the way to me, and with ace-high, we stand to have the best hand here most of the time. We raise to 25, and the straddler calls. The flop is 5-3-3 rainbow, and I lead out for $35, and the straddler calls again. The turn is another 5, and I bet out 100 this time, expecting to fold out most of his continuing range here. To my surprise, he really quickly tosses out 3 white chips, signaling a $300 bet. And that'll mark the end to this adventure. Speaking of punts, on the very next hand we find pocket 2s in the small blind. There are 2 limpers to the cutoff who decides to raise to 30. The button, small blind, big blind, and all limpers call for $30. Wow. Family pot anyone? We go 6 ways to the flop of Jack 10-8. and the first pre-flop limper open shoves for 400 and takes it down. The third time is supposed to be the charm, right? A player under the gun limps for $5. There's a person in mid-position who checks their missed blind, and the low jack limps before I raise to 30 with queen 9 of hearts in the hijack. The button, under the gun, and low jack all call. We go 4 ways to the flop of ace queen 4, and it checks around. The turn is the ace of spades, and now the under the gun player leads for 75. The low jack folds, and here I decide to raise to 200. The button folds, and now the under the gun player snap calls. In fact, I think the under the gun player got his calling chips in before the button threw his hand in the muck. That's how fast the call was. At this point, I'm placing the under the gun mostly on a draw, and a small likelihood he has a queen. On the off chance that this player has a queen, there's a pretty good chance his kicker might be better than mine. So on any inconsequential river, I'm firing big to exert as much fold equity as possible. The river is the 3 of spades, and the under the gun player checks again. I jam here for 480 effective, and the under the gun player quickly folds, exposing a queen face up. It feels good to get this one through. There's a lot of skill involved in poker, and I think that's one of the reasons we all enjoy the game. That said though, there's also an element of luck, and as many have downplayed that, I've always been of the volition that I'd rather be lucky than good, which this next hand shows. In this hand, there's one mid-position limper before it gets to the blind, who completes her 5, and I look down at queen 10 offsuit and check my option. The flop is queen 3-6 rainbow. The small blind leads up for 15, and I call while the field player folds. The turn is the deuce of diamonds, bringing in a backdoor flush draw. Small blind continues for 20, and for this price, I'm not really going anywhere. The river is the 10 of spades, and the small blind continues for 35. At this point, it's pretty apparent that this player has a top pair type of hand, trying to extract value out of a middling hand with this betting pattern. I just banked a pretty good river and raise all in as he did not have much behind. The small blind calls pretty quickly, announcing that 2 pair is good and exposes king queen. We start this hand with a 4-bet pre-flop shove in progress. Leading up to this hand, we've been playing 6-handed for maybe the last hour, and I've been getting somewhat out of line by mixing in some well-timed squeezing opportunities and 3-bets. In this hand, the hijack opens to 25, and the cutoff, button, and small blind all decide to call. I look down at pocket aces in the big blind and raise to 125. The hijack isn't having any of it and shoves all in for 345. Action folds to me, and I call it off. Though we're clearly the favorite to win this hand, no matter how many times I run into these situations, there's always the voice in the back of my head hoping for a good run out. This time, the board runs out really clean, and we table our hand. While the opponent doesn't show, we later find out that he had king-queen of spades. The person I stacked called it quits, and the table broke shortly after. Instead of waiting around for another table, it was getting relatively late, so I decided it was time to rack up and get out of there. Thanks again for joining me on another poker vlog. If you made it this far, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any future videos. Before I forget, here are the results from our 2-day session at Oceans 11. Day 1, in for 1,000, out for 1125. Day 2, in for 963, out for 1623. Episode 4 will be headed back to our hometown of Los Angeles, where we'll be battling out with the regulars in the 510 game at Commerce Casino. It's going to be full of action, and most of all, for those who haven't been playing much as of recent or have never experienced LA poker before, it'll hopefully give you a glimpse into what LA poker looks like in the fall of 2021. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and see you next time.